Hello, welcome to Unit 4 of our course. Unit 4 begins on Sunday, July 6th and ends on Saturday, July 12th at 11:59 p.m. I look forward to working with all of you during this unit. I hope that you enjoyed the break for the 4th of July holiday. During this unit, we will be examining aspects of American history and American culture from the 1960s and through the mid-1970s. Specifically, we will be examining the history of the Vietnam War and the impact that the Vietnam War had upon American culture. We will be examining the countercultural or hippie movement of the 1960s. And we will also be examining aspects of the women's rights movement as well. I look forward to working with you all. During this unit, you will be asked to participate in 2 discussion boards and to complete a primary source assignment and a film review. I would like to present a bit of context for the time period that we're looking at, and also to discuss each of the assignments for this unit. The 1960s, particularly the period from starting in 1965, was a very tumultuous period in American history. There was a great cultural shift that took place in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Really what you see is the breakdown of the conformity of the long decade of the 1950s, which we discussed last week. You see the emergence really of a new generation in American history, the baby boomers. Anyone who was born from 1945 to 1964 is considered to be a member of the baby boom generation. The baby boomers really start to enter adolescence and young adulthood in the late 1960s and early 1970s. At least the first wave of baby boomers begin to pass through adolescence and early adulthood during this period. So what you're seeing in the late 60s and early 70s is a period in American history where the largest generation in American history is entering adolescence. So it's hardly surprising that this is a period of great tumult, great unrest, great change, as the largest generation is passing through their teenage years. It was certainly a generational movement. The hippie movement attracted primarily young people. Now, there are some misconceptions about the hippie movement. Not all young people were hippies, certainly, and certainly most Americans were not hippies either during this era. Yet the hippie movement was a very large movement, attracting millions of young people within the movement. And the hippie movement had a profound impact, I should say, on American culture. The hippies basically challenged and rejected many aspects of the conformity that had been promoted by their parents' generation. The hippies rejected the materialism of American culture. The hippies argued that one's identity shouldn't be wrapped up in material possessions. The hippies basically said, our main goal in life is not going to be securing material comfort. Remember, the hippie generation had not grown up in depression and poverty. Most of the hippies had grown up in stable, fairly prosperous middle-class homes. They had never known want or poverty by and large. The hippie generation also often rebelled against the religious beliefs that were normative in the 1950s. Many hippies embraced Eastern religions like Buddhism and rejected mainstream religions of American life like Christianity and Judaism. The hippies also rejected the restrictive sexual norms of 1950s America. The hippie counterculture embraced, movements of free love, the idea that sexuality should not be confined to marriage. The hippie counterculture also rejected gender norms. The hippies argued that men and women should be free to choose their lifestyle, and that men shouldn't be confined to the realm of work, and that women shouldn't be confined to the realm of home, and that people should have freedom of choice about how to live their lives. The hippie counterculture also rejected militarism and promoted peace and was opposed to the Vietnam War. The hippie counterculture also embraced new forms of music, of rock and roll, of protest movement against the war in Vietnam. Hippies tended to live either in urban areas or college towns, or to move out to the rural communes as well. Haight-Ashbury was a big center of hippie activity, as was Greenwich Village. Haight-Ashbury is in San Francisco. Greenwich Village is in New York. Madison, Wisconsin was a big college town and center of the hippie counterculture. And some hippies did move out of the cities and try to embrace a more rural life and communion with nature as well. There were mass protest movements against the war in Vietnam. That was very much a part of the hippie counterculture as well. The hippies also tended to embrace more acceptance. Hippies rejected racism. Hippies tended to reject homophobia. There were some negative aspects of the hippie counterculture, I would argue. Part of the hippie counterculture was the experimentation with drugs. Drugs like LSD and marijuana, which could prove very destructive to human health, certainly. The film that you're watching for this week is entitled Summer of Love, a documentary about the Summer of Love. The Summer of Love occurred in 1967 in San Francisco in Haight-Ashbury. Haight-Ashbury is a community in San Francisco that was well known for its hippie counterculture. The hippies of the community declared that summer would be the summer of love and invited people from all across the country to move to the Haight, as it was known. And literally hundreds of thousands of young people descended on Haight-Ashbury during this period. People as young as 13 years old were leaving home and moving to Haight-Ashbury, living on the streets. This was so common that federal authorities literally told parents that they weren't looking for children who disappeared in the summer of '67 because they probably had gone to Haight-Ashbury for the Summer of Love. So you had tens of thousands of people, living in the streets of San Francisco. Certainly there was a great deal of experimentation with drugs. And you had groups like the Diggers, a group who, would go around scavenging for food to feed the community that had descended on the Haight-Ashbury community. So you'll see a bit about that experience, which I think shows some of the positive and some of the negative aspects of the hippie counterculture. Ultimately, there did emerge problems in terms of crime and drug abuse in the community. So you'll be asked to complete that film review. The first of the discussion board questions deals with the hippie counterculture and asks you to evaluate aspects of the hippie counterculture. One of the other discussion board question deals with the origins of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was one of the hugely significant events of this era. And it's often, I think, a conflict that's misunderstood. You're asked to discuss the origins of the conflict in Vietnam. And the conflict in Vietnam can be traced back very far in history. Vietnam became a colony of France in the late 1800s. The French referred to Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos as French Indochina. It was part of a large movement in the late 1800s where European countries took over most of Asia. So the French ruled Indochina, which included Vietnam, from the 1880s up to 1941. And there did emerge during this period of time a Vietnamese resistance to French colonial rule. Oftentimes, the peoples of Asia did not want to be ruled by foreign powers from Europe, of course. Or at least there were significant elements of the population that did not want this. Ho Chi Minh emerged as the leader of this Vietnamese opposition to French rule by 1920. Ho Chi Minh had studied in France, although he was a native of Vietnam, and he wanted Vietnam to be independent. He went to the conference at Versailles at the end of World War I and demanded Vietnamese independence. When he was rebuffed by the leaders of the United States and Western Europe, he traveled to the Soviet Union and received training as a communist revolutionary. By the early 1920s, he had returned to Vietnam, and he organized a Vietnamese Communist Party known as the Viet Minh. He led a communist insurrection against the French. So from the early 1920s until 1941, Ho Chi Minh led this communist guerrilla war against French rule in Vietnam. In the early 1940s, the Japanese Empire invaded and took over Vietnam from the French. This is part of the Second World War. The Japanese treated the Vietnamese population with incredible brutality, executing huge numbers of innocent civilians. Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese communists from 1941 to 1945 fought against the Japanese. The United States at this point, from 1941 to 45 during World War II, actually provided weapons and arms to Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese communists to fight against the Japanese. When World War II ended in 1945 and the Japanese evacuated Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh declared that Vietnam was an independent country, issuing a statement very similar to the U.S. Declaration of Independence, beginning, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights." Ho Chi Minh hoped that the United States might support the independence movement, or at least not stand in the way. The French were determined to hold on to their colony in Vietnam, and the French would fight a protracted war from 1945 to 1954 in an effort to retain control of their colony in Vietnam, fighting against fierce Vietnamese opposition. The United States government would provide huge amounts of money and weapons to the French to fight against the Vietnamese in this war. 80% of all of the money used in the war was provided by the United States, but still there were no U.S. troops involved. These were French forces. In 1954, after an unsuccessful war, the French withdrew from Vietnam. The French set up a government in South Vietnam, while Ho Chi Minh and the communists took control of the north. So now in 1954, for the first time, Vietnam was divided. North Vietnam was ruled by the Vietnamese communists. South Vietnam was ruled by a Vietnamese government that had essentially been set up by the French government. At this point, the United States government developed a relationship with Ngo Dinh Diem, the French-educated Vietnamese leader of South Vietnam, and the United States began to funnel money and weapons to the government of South Vietnam. And at this point, a civil war began to emerge in South Vietnam. Vietnamese communists were fighting against Ngo Dinh Diem and the French-supported government of South Vietnam, and now the United States became involved and started supporting the government of Ngo Dinh Diem. So this civil war continues from really 1954 up into 1964 for about a decade. The North Vietnamese are providing weapons to the South Vietnamese communists. The United States is providing weapons and support to Ngo Dinh Diem and the South Vietnamese government. And then in 1964, the United States begins to directly become involved in the war in terms of sending in forces. In 1964, the United States military begins bombing North Vietnam, and in 1965, the first U.S. combat troops are sent into Vietnam. By 1968, there will be 500,000 U.S. soldiers fighting in Vietnam, the highest point during the war. So the United States would fight a protracted war against the North Vietnamese and the South Vietnamese communists from 1964 to 1972. The United States would not be successful in retaining and fighting off the communists in South Vietnam. In 1972, the U.S. would withdraw its combat forces from South Vietnam. And finally, in 1975, the North Vietnamese communists would take over South Vietnam and unite Vietnam under communist leadership. If you look at it, though, from an American perspective, the war took place from 1964 to 1972. From a Vietnamese perspective, though, the war really took place from 1920 to 1975 for 55 years. It started with the Vietnamese fighting against the French for independence. Then there was a phase where they fought against the Japanese for independence. Then another phase where the Vietnamese fought against the French for independence. And then a period, finally, where the Vietnamese communists fought against the United States. Ho Chi Minh, by the way, died in 1968 before the war reached its ultimate conclusion. So you'll have an opportunity to discuss your views on that conflict. Finally, there's the primary source assignment. For the primary source assignment, you will read one document related to the anti-war movement, the movement against the war in Vietnam, and you will also read a document related to the feminist movement, the movement for women's rights, that really flourishes in the 1960s and early 1970s. I very much look forward to working with you during this unit. Thank you.